Hello, Changemaker.
Welcome to the Innovation Room,
A place for business leaders,
change agents, and change champions.
anyone who wants to know where digital transformation is taking us,
A place that sparks ideas.
and explores what's really possible with software and technology.
Ready?
Let's see what's happening.
As business leaders, we need to both understand and influence people's behaviours. As the fast-paced changing world has begun its new evolution cycle with the advancements in AI, being part of the group of leaders who understand the behaviour of their clients, employees, and stakeholders and are able to influence them is a massive success factor. When you need to measure more complex metrics to ensure your investment in technology is going to have the highest return, you walk into the realm of measuring the return on change. My guest today specializes in applying behavioral science to marketing. He makes the complex concept of how humans make the choices they make simple and understandable, with real examples in business and society. Richard Shotton, author of The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice, helps businesses to apply behavioral science to solve their challenges and realize their opportunities. Seems like something every business needs in the new era of artificial intelligence. I am Somayeh, CEO of Geeks. Please join me in the Innovation Room to learn from Richard Shotton how you can dramatically increase the return on changes you want to make in your organization. Hi, Richard. Thank you for joining me in the Innovation Room. Do you mind starting with a quick introduction of yourself?
So my name's Richard Shotton, and I specialise in applying behavioural science to marketing. So behavioural science, by that I essentially mean the study of how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave. And I've written 2 books on the topic: Choice Factory about 5 years ago, and a new one called The Illusion of Choice, which came out a couple of months ago.
Cool, wonderful. And as our tradition, before we get into your topic of expertise, which is very, very fascinating, and I have a billion questions to ask. But who would you bring with yourself into the innovation room if you were going to do some innovation work?
That's a tough question.
It can be dead or alive, real or fiction, and it can be more than one if you really want to bring.
I think I'm focused on someone alive, and I think I'd bring Matthew Side. Are you familiar with him?
No.
So he had a first career as a table tennis player, represented Britain, British champion, played at the Olympics. And then after that, he started writing about the mentality of sport, bringing psychology into sport. And over the last 5 or 10 years has broadened out into much wider areas. So he wrote a book called The Rebel Ideas about the importance of diversity. He's written a book called Black Box Thinking about learning from our mistakes. Yeah. And I think he's brilliant at taking really complex academic ideas, simplifying them without losing the nuance, but explaining them in simple terms, and crucially applying them to business challenges. So I think if I wanted to get to the nub of an issue to solve a problem, I think he'd be pretty good to bring
I think you would, with what you're explaining, you would be very good together, because that's what you do as well. You might be too similar. Like maybe I need to challenge.
I didn't realise there was some kind of red yellow card option here. I thought
not that there was. I was just thinking about what would that look like, you and somebody similar to you, because that's what you do. I came to know you when you did a speak in our business group, and you simplified very, very complex matters in a way that was very easy to understand and very applicable. So that was the reason that I thought, he should be on our podcast. Like people need to hear, like our audience need to hear Richard's point of view. Wonderful. So this we are focusing in the past few months. We have been focusing a lot on AI and shift of the strategy that businesses had to make because of the big impact it's going to have on the whole world in one way, but also in the way businesses have to redefine even their vision or their strategy completely, because it opens doors or closes doors that is very impactful for the business. We got to the point that I was asked many times that how do you decide how to measure the return on the investment you're making, because you don't know, they are uncertain, or generally on technology it's not an easy task to measure the investment, the return on the investment that you have made, which made me think that we need to have a series. And I wanted to open up the series with you because I think it's a lot. It's got a lot to do with behavior, but a series on return on change. So changing the dialogue from return on investment, we spend this much, that many pounds or that many dollars. How much did we get from, or how much did it move the revenue? How much did it save us cost? So the money matter, and change it to the conversation on the return on change. Part of the change is behavioral change, and part of that change is like the things that are not easily measurable or easily understandable. So I wanted to ask your opinion about when businesses change strategy, what are the challenges to make it actually happen?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time we do change of a strategy, but it never gets to actually being implemented.
Yes, so there are lots of challenges, and I think lots of ideas from behavioural science on how to overcome those challenges. One of those mistakes I think businesses make too regularly is to use social proof in the wrong direction. And what I mean by that is social proof is the idea that people are a herd species. We're a social animal. We are deeply influenced by what others do. And there are lots and lots of studies that support this idea. So the broad idea, and this is used by marketers all the time, is if you tell people a product or a behavior is popular, people are more likely to want that product. It becomes more popular still. So you go to a supermarket, you go into the cereal aisle, and Weetabix will say they're the #1 breakfast cereal. That is a positive and effective use of social proof. Now think about how most companies communicate in the workplace. When it comes to new strategies and new things to adopt, all too often companies use social proof in completely the wrong direction and make the situation worse. What many people do, many companies will say, not enough of you are using AI, or even in mundane matters, not enough of you are sending your invoices out in time. It's 100 of you and 95 are not doing it. The problem with that is you're emphasizing the scale of the unwanted behavior, and you will remove a sense of transgression and make that unwanted behavior more commonplace. That is not speculation. So there's a famous study by an Arizona state psychologist called Robert Cialdini. And in his study, he finds a national park in America called the Arizona Petrified Wood National Park. And he's picked this park because loads of tourists go to the park and they steal bits of petrified wood. They take them home as mementos. So he wants to see what happens if you emphasize that lots of this theft is happening. So he strings up CCTV cameras in the middle of nowhere. He points them at a path, and he sprinkles bits of petrified wood along the path. So anyone walking down has the opportunity to steal. They're in the middle of nowhere, so they think they'll get away with it. He then monitors the proportion of people that steal something. And he sets up 3 scenarios. First scenario, there's no sign, and about 3% of people steal a bit of wood. He puts up next a sign saying don't steal, it's wrong, basically. And theft rates dropped to about 1.7%. So he's shown that you can influence this behavior. But then finally, and most relevant for us, he then puts up a sign that purposely emphasizes the scale of theft. He says 12 tons of wood have been stolen each year, and it's ruining the look of the park. Now, when he does that, theft rates go, remember it was 3% in the control, theft rates go from 3% to 7.9%.
Wow.
Cialdini says this is a crime promotion strategy, not a crime prevention strategy. If you emphasize lots of people are not behaving the way that you want in work, in a commercial setting, in a personal setting, you will make the situation worse. You'll remove a sense of transgression, and you'll enable and encourage people to misbehave. So that's probably the first thing.
It's very, very interesting. Don't forget the other things you want to say, but I have seen this specifically on the
conversation around the AI, everybody, all the media are talking about, oh, we should be scared, like we should be doing something. Not enough of us are talking about how it can go wrong. And then my observation has been people don't want to talk about it. So people literally saying, I don't want to talk about AI. And I'm like, what like, why? Like, you should be wanting, because everybody's saying that, that there is so much. And by people, I mean like people literally in parties, in like you get on a taxi, like the public reaction to the media saying that we should be more talking about the wrong side of the AI. People just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to engage with it anymore. So I've seen that happen.
So I mean, I think it is a very commonplace mistake. In fact, Cialdini, he says it's the government's big mistake, and what he means by that is governmental communications often inadvertently emphasize bad behavior. So they might go out and say loads of youths carry knives, or lots of students get drunk, or lots of doctors don't turn up. Sorry, lots of patients don't turn up to their doctor's appointment. Hopefully not the other way around. So it's certainly something you see quite regularly in communications. So I think you're right on that scale issue. The second problem that you mentioned there is around emphasizing fear. And that is a dodgy tactic at best. There's an idea from George Lowenstein, who I think is at Carnegie Mellon, and he came up with an idea called the ostrich effect, which is quite a good description of it. So he looked at data from Vanguard, the big American fund provider, and a Swedish equivalent, and they gave him access to data on how often investors check their portfolios. And what you see is when the stock market's rising, people check their portfolio reasonably regularly. But when the stock market drops, people suddenly stop checking their portfolio. Lowenstein's argument is this is a logical error. That information data is equally useful whether the stock market's rising or falling. You could even argue it's more useful when you're in this dangerous situation. But he says that what people tend to do when they are faced with a negative bit of information, they tend to stick their head in the sands. They would rather ignore the problem and avoid feeling bad than grapple with the underlying issue. So for something like AI, I think it is very counterproductive for people to try and scare audiences into changing their behavior. Because what tends to happen is if change is hard, rather than change behavior, people do the easy thing, which is just try and forget about the problem and think about the many other things that they can spend their time on.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was the second thing about business strategy being?
I think the other really big theme from behavioral science where people who are trying to manage change go wrong is a misprioritization of appeal and motivation over ease. So Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize back in 2002 for economics, probably the most illustrious behavioral scientist there is. He was asked in a recent interview to look back on his entire career, and Kahneman's in his 80s, so he's a long career, lots and lots of experiments, and he was asked to reflect back on what was the single biggest thing he'd learned. And without missing a beat, he said, that's straightforward, 3 words, make it easy. According to Kahneman, people who want to change the behavior of others, they tend to overemphasize the importance of making the desired behavior as appealing and attractive as possible. And they tend to underestimate the importance of removing small bits of friction. So Kahneman's argument is the first thing you should do as a business, if you want people to change their behavior, is to think, what are the tiny little barriers? What are the really seemingly inconsequential barriers that you think aren't going to have any effect at all that might be stopping those people adopting the behavior, and then put more efforts into removing them. So prioritize making the behavior you want to encourage easy rather than doing what most people do, which is try and motivate people to think that behavior is wonderful and appealing.
Yeah. And can you give some practical examples? Because I know you do work a lot with businesses, so you have a lot of practical, you don't talk theory, you have examples. Can you give some examples of what has been done in a bad way and what would be the good way of doing it?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And it's one of the things I love about behavioral science. It's never something that is based on logic alone. So great that Kahneman says that, but everything has to be proved experimentally. One of my favorite examples around the impact of ease comes from an academic called Olshan, and he worked with a hospital. So it's a real world study. And he's at the Penn Medicine Unit. That's the attached hospital to that area. And between 2014 and 2017, he measured the proportion of drugs that were prescribed and split them either into generics or branded. So generic is exactly the same as a branded drug. It's just sold under a, not Viagra, it'd be sildenafil. So you've got much cheaper option, which most health services want you to push the generic. So the original setup at the hospital was there was a drop-down menu for doctors, and when they wanted to prescribe a drug, they had to scroll through the branded drugs to get to the generics. And in that setup, about 75% of the drugs prescribed were generics. Olshan's intervention was to flip the order of that drop-down menu. So now you have the generic drugs at the top, branded drugs at the bottom. So all he's doing is adding about 5 or 6 seconds of friction effort for people to get down to the branded drugs. Even though that is a tiny bit of effort for what could be life and death decisions, he finds that the use of generics goes up to 98%. So you've got this 31% improvement. So that's interesting because it takes Kahneman's idea and it shows that even tiny bits of friction can have an outsized effect. And it is not just members of the public who are affected. It's not just consumers. This affects professionals in their working lives as well.
Yeah.
So absolutely, there are experimental bits of data that back up this idea.
If you're an ethical business and you want to use it in the right way, how do you not manipulate people? How do you know that you're using it in the right way?
Yeah. So the Olshan intervention is an interesting one because it shows there is no neutral way of displaying information. I think that's probably a key thing. Let's say this won't be the right numbers, but let's say there were 20 drugs. Something has to be the first item you see. So there is no neutral position. So what I would hope people do is think what is in the best interests of the audience. And I would certainly argue that most people in the experiment intervention that I mentioned surely would prefer that the cheaper drug was being used rather than a more expensive branded one. So I think Olshan was acting in a societally responsible manner. But I would argue that behavioral science, it's only a tool. It's neutral. And unfortunately, people can put it to bad ends or they can put it to positive ends.
So is any technology, isn't it? So is AI. I always say any technology, including AI, is mostly they're like a knife. You can kill people with, you can do a heart surgery and save them. You can chop some vegetables and make a soup. It's your choice how you use it and the skills you have to use it. So I guess it's the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to use the example of rhetoric. I think people, if you look back at some of these old technologies like a knife or old ways of persuading people, it becomes more obvious. And you could think about rhetoric. No one thinks learning how to present well or speak well is an evil or a good thing. I think people recognize that it's neutral. You can use rhetoric to inspire people to acts of greatness. You can use rhetoric to inspire people to hate each other. It's not the tool, it's the end you put it to.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
I would always prioritize the intention over the tool itself.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the metrics you can know as an employee or anybody in the business. You're working for a good business or not, and as a customer, you know a brand is a good brand or not. If you're aware of these, these things, and then you can see how they are using it actually.
Well, that awareness and openness is a really interesting point. I think it's in the book Nudge, which was written by Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a couple of years ago. And he wrote it about 15 years ago, I think. He has a little section in there around ethics. And I think he mentions an American philosopher called John Rawls. And Rawls talks about the transparency principle, which is essentially if you are trying to nudge people, if you're trying to use behavioral science, think about whether you would be embarrassed about the intervention if your customer or your staff knew you were doing it. If you are embarrassed to be found out, that's an alarm bell. So
yeah, that's
go
a
back
really
to the
good
old
one.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I don't think anyone would be embarrassed about saying, well, we're going to put the generics at the top because we think we're spending too much money on branded. No one would be embarrassed if they were found out to be doing that. But absolutely, there are, I think, some techniques. Sometimes you go on these hard pressure travel sites sometimes where they overuse these nudges and behavioral science into interventions, and they might be embarrassed if people were aware of all the things they're doing.
Very interesting. One of the other topics that I am very interested in, and I see a lot of businesses that I talk to, they are concerned about, is the relationship between AI and human. And I want to narrow it to the context of work, not the whole AI human relationship. So they're worried about their staff who are hearing a lot from the mainstream media on thousands of jobs are going to be lost, or AI is going to destroy humanity and that kind of stuff. And they're struggling how to introduce the new strategies they are developing on changing their business to become an AI enabled business, basically bringing the AI into their business and into their take it to the market for their customers. What advice do you have in terms of how to tackle that, how to break those barriers?
That's a great question. There is a wonderful study from a Harvard psychologist called Ellen Langer, I think might be useful here. So this is one of my favorite ever studies, and she ran it in 1975. So it's quite an old one, but I think still pertinent. And she goes around an office block in America and she sells people lottery tickets for $1. The twist in the experiment is some people get to pick their numbers, some people are given their numbers. Langer then waits a week, goes back to the office just before the draw is about to take place for the lottery, and she tries to buy the tickets back off people. She finds
very interesting, interesting experiment. I can only imagine, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I can only imagine the attachment people are gonna develop towards those numbers.
Absolutely. So the first thing she finds, and she looks at the people who were given their numbers, they want $1.96 on average to sell back the ticket. So absolutely, there is a sense of attachment. They want almost twice as much as they paid. And a psychologist would call that the endowment effect. Once we own something, we tend to become more attached to it. We tend to value it more. So absolutely, that's true. But her experiment wasn't really about the endowment effect. It was about the difference between those who hadn't picked the numbers, the $1.96 people, and those who had picked the numbers. And for people who had picked the numbers, they wanted, I think, $8.67 on average. So a more than fourfold increase in valuation based on this tiny, tiny bit of involvement and control. So Langer called this the illusion of control, this idea that one of the big drives of human behavior is this requirement to have a sense of agency, a sense of control. Even in something like a commodity, like a lottery ticket, where it has no real impact, no financial benefit, we still end up valuing the item more if we've been involved. So I think that could be an interesting study to apply to get around people's worries and nervousness. Don't force the policy from on high. Ask your staff their opinions, get them involved in the process. And even if it's only inconsequential areas that you let them shape, that small involvement would, I think, minimize fear and increase the probability people are going to be happy with the end result.
It's very, very interesting and make me full of myself. I need to have my ego under control, because I was just this morning in a meeting with talking to governors of a school and talking about how the teachers are feeling about ChatGPT, and because it's in education sector, it's a big immediate problem of like all of a sudden everybody's essays are amazing, and we have no way of
Yeah.
finding out how. So they have this conflict of, do we want them to use it? Do we have what can we do? Can we control them not to use? And I was suggesting that I think, like, why don't you just call a meeting with the teachers and ask them what they think should be done, and then a couple of students, and ask them what they think is the way, because isn't it not the whole purpose of education system to prepare people for the adult life and like get them to be able to interact in the society?
Yeah.
So if we take it away from them and tell them no, you shouldn't use it, then it means we are not preparing them for the world, because they're going to go out in the world that it is there and they can use it, but they haven't learned how to. So that was very, very fascinating that they didn't even think about, let's just bring them together and ask them what they think should be done.
Well, yes, and I think you've got two benefits. You've got people are more likely to agree with the end output, and then secondly, as long as you're harnessing a diverse range of opinions and encouraging them to express themselves rather than just conform to the most senior person, you should get a better set of inputs as well. So all things being equal, same output would be rated higher, but you should have a better input.
Yeah. How about customers? Do you see any different? So, for example, there are sectors that are very resistant to change. So, if those sectors are your customers, then you're struggling a lot. So, how do you deal with that? So, say I have an example. We have a really amazing client. He's been on the podcast a couple of times talking about how he uses technology. They are in property sector, prop tech, and their clients would be the law firms. Law firms do not want to change.
Yeah.
They do not want to. So that, like, when you're faced with that, he has his views and he explains how he overcomes that. But I'm interested to know, if you get that kind of resistance from the whole industry, like a whole sector is resistant, what do you do to break through that?
So maybe two ideas. One is a very straightforward one, and one is a bit more complicated, but I think the results can be even more powerful. So the first simple idea is that actually an awful lot of people are resistant to change, and psychologists say, well, they're being quite sensible, because if you weighed up every decision, life would be unbearably complex. So what people tend to do is either rely on quick rules of thumb, like, I'm in the supermarket, I'll pick the most popular option, I'll pick the middle option, or more extremely, they don't even weigh up their decision. They just repeat the same decision again and again when in a similar situation. So habits are well studied by psychologists, and they account for a remarkably large degree of our behavior. So it is I think a reasonably common situation in which people are resistant to change. But psychologists don't just quantify the scale of the problem, they also identify predictable moments when habits are weakened. And one of those moments are when we enter new time periods. So the argument here comes from Catherine Miltman, or Katie Miltman at Wharton. And she says habits are sticky because people want to be consistent with their past selves, that there is a lot of social pressure and social opprobrium for people who are inconsistent. We look down on inconsistent people. So Miltman says when we enter new time periods, the link with our past self is weakened and we tend to be more open to change. So that's her logical argument. She then tests that by looking at a variety of different data sets. Google search terms around things like quitting smoking, starting dieting, registrations at gyms over time, and over time visits to a website in America called Stick, where people make public pledges to change their behavior. And every one of these data sets shows the same pattern, that when you enter a new time period, there is this spike of increased churn in behavior.
New time period, meaning, can you explain that?
Oh, yeah. So beginning of a new time period would be beginning of the week, Monday, beginning of the month, first of the month, beginning of the year, January, not March, after people's birthdays, after public holidays. All of these fresh start moments are typified by an increased openness to change. Now, if you then look at bigger changes in people's lives, bigger fresh start moments, moving house, getting a promotion, starting a new job, there is an even greater increase in likelihood to change behavior. So don't just think about how I'm going to persuade someone to change. Think about what moment I'm going to try and make that intervention. And it's often the moment that's as important as the content of what you say.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any sort of advice on, because I think once you've understood a certain behavior or the reason behind a certain behavior, it's easier to use those kind of techniques. But how do you understand them?
So maybe one thing, the biggest thing, is recognizing that firstly, other people don't necessarily think the same way as we do. There's an idea called the false consensus effect. We tend to extrapolate our thinking onto other people. So if you're a vegetarian, it's not that you think the rest of the population is vegetarian. You probably overestimate how many other people are. If you read The Guardian, you probably overestimate how many other people read The Guardian. So being aware that we tend to project our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors on other people is a good start. And then recognizing that our natural ability to see into other people's minds is not that great. We tend, again, to be overconfident about those types of ability. So I think recognizing those 2 points suggests that you have to spend more time trying to put yourselves in the shoes of other people. And once you've done that, perhaps the single biggest thing, and this is the harder part, if you want to change resistant people, the best thing to do is not try and change those other people, because that's very, very hard. It's to think, how can I reframe the behavior I'm trying to encourage as being aligned with what those people already think? So the classic example of this, and it's not so well known in the UK, but it's massive in America. It's one of the really famous advertising campaigns. Back in the 80s, the Department of Transport in Texas was spending $20 million a year. I mean, Texas is massive, on picking up litter from the roadside. So they wanted to stop basically young men chucking their cans and their McDonald's and their bags of crisps out of the car when they're finished with them. What they did for year on year on year was put up signs saying, "Keep Texas beautiful." And the problem with those messages was they appealed to the committee who made the advertising, not the perpetrators. The committee were concerned environmentalists. The young men, rebellious young men in their pickup trucks, they didn't care. So the committee were advertising to themselves. So mid-80s, I think it was 1986, they get a new ad agency in, point this out, and say, look, what you want to do is reframe littering as being an affront to state pride. You want to think what motivates these rebellious young men, this sense of machismo, and then make littering feel like an affront to that. So they came up with the line, "Don't mess with Texas," which they got quarterbacks and rugged actors and country and western stars to sing or talk about, and they reframed the act of littering not as not an affront to environmental stewardship, but the kind of thing that someone from Oklahoma or an interloper from Louisiana might not do. An insult to any red-blooded Texasman. So that, to me, is a brilliant piece of behavior change, because at the heart of it is a piece of humility. It's very hard to change people's worldview. What's easy to do is reframe the behavior you're trying to encourage to be in line with someone else's worldview. Harder to do, but wow, the effect of that campaign was actually massive. It's probably the most successful anti-littering campaign ever. The amount of littering dropped by 72% over the next few years.
Wow.
And the phrase, it's phenomenal. It's a piece of Texan culture now.
Yeah.
George W. Bush used it in his commencement speech, or his presidential acceptance speech. There is even and I'm not making this up, there is a nuclear submarine out there somewhere in the Atlantic with USSS whatever, "Don't mess with Texas" is on the side. So big cultural impact, but also affecting behavior.
Yeah, interesting. So am I right then in saying that if you want to know that you have understood the group of people, being your employees or customers' behavior, look at the outcome of the change you were looking for. If the change hasn't happened, then it means you haven't understood them. So go back, try to understand them first before trying 10 different campaigns, messages, or different communication.
I think that's fair. So I think the element would be, firstly, genuinely understand people. Make sure you're not just projecting what you think motivates them onto the audience. And then secondly, the big thing that campaign did was change littering from being about the environment to being about state pride. The audience who you need to persuade didn't care about the environment. They did care about state pride. It was, I think that's the sleight of hand, the magic that really boosts the experiment. So let's say it's fear about adoption of AI. Well, maybe your company has in the past had, pride in being innovative or trying new things. Frame AI not as something wildly different, but just a continuation of the spirit you've had before. Now, exactly how you reframe it will depend on your ethos and your company history, but I think there are plenty of opportunities to do that.
Yeah, very, very fascinating stuff. In terms of what you have seen in media, because what I love about when you talk about behavioral science are all the examples that you bring up, because those examples resonate, and it makes me certainly, and I'm sure other people, to be able to then connect to their own specific circumstance. So what examples have you seen in the UK specifically, and in a world of business, like employee-employer relationship or customer business relationship, that you have seen it being done really well, that you would recommend?
So I think from the principles we've discussed, we talked very briefly about social proof. The government has definitely improved on business communications there. So what you see now, if you get a letter from the tax office, rather than just telling you you're going to get a fine if you don't pay your tax in time, they now open the message with a single sentence which says 9 out of 10 people pay their tax in time. That is a simple but very effective use of social proof. And there's some lovely governmental studies that prove putting that extra line in significantly increases.
What if it was like, I'm just trying to bring it to the context of the business and the challenges that the businesses have. What if, for example, that percentage is like 20%? So mentioning that is not that of a great, like, do you want to be part of like the 20% who pay?
So a couple of ways you could look at that. I used to work, one of the clients I work with is the NHS, and they used to go out and say only 4% of people donate blood. Now that makes it sound like no one does it. That makes it sound like the normal behavior is to not donate.
It. Yeah.
That's a no-no from a psychology perspective. So one way to talk to them about changing that was not to say only 4% of people give blood. Say, and I won't get my maths right here, but 3 million people give blood every year. It's exactly the same number. One feels small, one feels large. The other way of doing it is, if you are trying to start a behavior in your business and it's still a minority behavior, but it's growing, there are a series of studies from Sparkman at Wharton at Stanford which show if you emphasize growth in a behavior, even if it's a small behavior, that taps very effectively into social proof. So their study from 2017, they work with a cafe, and sometimes they put up signs on people's tables saying 3 out of 10 people eat a meat-free diet. And in that setup, 17% of the diners ordered meat-free. Other times they had the same stat, 3 out of 10, but they prefaced it with something like, more and more people are giving up meat. Now 3 out of 10 Americans try and limit their meat consumption. Same stat, but framed as a growing number. And in that setup, there was a doubling of meat-free ordering. It gets exact doubling, as a 34%.
Yeah. That's the
honestly
fear of, that's playing on the fear of missing out, right? So you don't want to not be part of that right behavior, basically.
I think it's very close. So I think social proof would be emphasizing lots of people are doing this. Scarcity is when you say, there are only 2 vegetarian dinners left. That, I think, would be scarcity. Now, those two things are certainly related. And there are studies that show, by Workshall at University of Virginia, if you explain scarcity, we've only got 2 cookies left to sell you today because they've proved very popular. So you explain scarcity through social proof. That's more powerful than using either one of the biases on its own.
Very fascinating stuff. It's really important, because I think businesses spend millions and millions, pounds or dollars, whatever, however you want to frame it, on digital transformation.
Yeah.
And stats shows like 87% of the digital transformation projects fail, and there are reasons. So we have published an ebook on the most 12 common reasons why they fail, and 4 of them, or one category, is like behavioral, or people reasons that they fail. And things like, even small things, they seem small, but these could actually make a big difference in the adoption and the, bringing people along and making sure everybody on feels good about the massive change that they are going to go through.
Interesting you mentioned small. I would say that's a theme of behavioral science, that the scale of the intervention, the scale of the impact are often unrelated. Very small changes can have large effects. Changing a word here, removing a click on a website, small changes can definitely have large impacts. So if you're going to spend millions upon millions of pounds or dollars on a project, why not test some of the ideas we've been discussing? The great thing is it doesn't cost anything. You have to order your drop down menu in a particular way. You have to communicate.
I think it's the human. I don't know what it is. It's the human. Is it ego? Is it we know better? Is it what it, because you're quite right. Like we talk to our clients about, let's just do a UX research before you decide to replace this whole system, because you don't even know if the system is the problem. It might be something completely irrelevant, but it's very hard for them, because it's almost like people make up their mind about what other, it's exactly the stuff that you were saying earlier. People make up their mind about why people are doing what they do, or how they perceive the world. I
think you're right. You touched on overconfidence. I think that is definitely a point. There's a lot of studies about people being overconfident about their looks, their humor, all sort of their intelligence. But my favorite study is, I think he's at University of Southampton. There's a psychologist called Sedekides, and I may have mispronounced that. He goes to young offenders institutes and asks people there to rate themselves versus the public. And even that group, they are in jail for misdemeanors. They rate themselves as more moral than the average person. It's something like 80% of people think they're more moral than the average person. So there is a widespread finding. So I think you're definitely right with overconfidence. The other one that I would add in is, too often when people research, they directly ask their customers what they want. Now, if you directly ask your customer or your staff what they want, they are not going to come back and mention some of these biases. People will describe their behavior as if they were cold calculating machines, and that every decision is weighed up and rationally evaluated. So if you listen to what people say in focus groups, if you listen to surveys, it can often send you off in the wrong direction. What I would suggest, and what psychologists do, is basically do an A/B test. Set up 2 different scenarios, keep all the variables the same apart from one, and then any difference in those scenarios you attribute back to the single change variable. The only difference with an A/B test is, rather than in the creative world and marketing world, where they tend to test the final creative, what you want to do is test the underlying psychological insight, find out if it works, and then that insight will be useful for you forever. They don't go out of fashion.
Yeah, wonderful. It's very hard to pause or finish the conversation, but I want to go back to your books, because they're wonderful. I've read one. The other one is in my waiting list of many books to read, so it's at close to the top of the list. But can you tell people why they should? Because I think everybody needs to read both of them.
Well, that's very kind.
Can you tell the audience what they're going to learn and why they should read these books?
So what I've tried to do in both of them. First book, I picked 25 insights from behavioral science that I think are most relevant for business and marketing. 1 chapter per bias. And then what I try and do is, for each of them, run through the academic evidence very quickly. Then my experiments that show those biases, ideas are still relevant today commercially. And then finally, the most important bit from my perspective is I talk about how you can practically apply those ideas. And one of the things we talked about right at the beginning, what I really try and do is communicate that as simply and easy as possible. What I find many academics do is unnecessarily complicate these topics. The experiments, if you get down to the heart of them, they're not complicated. But there's a phrase about psychologists that they have physics envy. So unfortunately, if you go to the original academic work, it is plastered in statistics and unnecessarily complex jargon. So I try and strip that all away and just focus on the core insights.
So thank you so much, Richard. We make sure that we put the link to the books when we publish the podcast. To finish off, do you have any one advice for businesses how to make the return on change better?
I think having a spirit of experimentation. So think about the ideas that we've discussed, 6 or 7 different studies. Think about one of those that would be easy and low cost to test at your business. Run an experiment or two. Likelihood is it will work and you'll see an improvement in returns. And once you've got that confidence that behavioral science can work for your unique business, your category, then I think that hopefully stimulates everyone else to be excited and you can roll out on a larger scale. But embrace the spirit of experimentation and have behavioral science as the fuel behind those experiments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us in the Innovation Room.
We hope it sparks some ideas.
Want to learn more about what we do?
Maybe you could even be our next guest.
And spark some ideas yourself.
Find us at Geeks Limited.
And join us again soon.
Because real change never stops.